Present tonight, we have Ms. Kathy Moore, Mr. Darrell Lopez, Mr. William Sheridan, Mr. Matt Young, Mr. David Pollack, Mr. Tommy Minton, and absent tonight is Mr. Lawrence Wright.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Are we having technical issues?
No, I had raised it just to make sure it was working.
Okay. Before we get into the agenda, Teresa, do you have some new folks you wanted to introduce?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to introduce our new staff members. We have Mr. Dave Harrell. He's our new Development Review Manager. He's replacing Jenna Fruitt. And we have Ms. Anoch Whitfield. She's our Planning Manager, and she's replacing Ms. Deborah Pierre.
Thank you. You got big shoes to fill.
And welcome.
Okay, now is that you having technical difficulties?
Apparently, yes.
Something, maybe the meeting is in the back, playing in the back.
Just shut it off.
Okay, the first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the June 13th meeting. Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. We also had the minutes sent to us for the July 11th meeting. Did everyone have an opportunity to review those? Okay. Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next is public comment. This is the time for anyone wishing to speak to the board about any item that's not up for public hearing tonight. Seeing none, we'll close public comment. Our next item is public hearing for ordinance number 1654, the wireless infrastructure moratorium. Teresa?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a request for the local planning agency to consider and make a recommendation for ordinance number 1654, approving the adoption of a citywide temporary moratorium on permitting wireless infrastructure on public utility poles within the city right-of-ways. Committee substitute for House Bill 687 passed the Florida House of Representatives on April 28, 2017, and the legislation was subsequently passed by the Florida Senate on the same day. On June 23, 2017, Governor Scott approved House Bill 687 over the objections expressed by numerous local governments and advocacy groups. It has been referred to as the wireless giveaway. The legislation became effective on July 1, 2017. The legislation has been initially codified as Chapter 2017-136 Laws of Florida. The legislation is assigned the common name of the Advanced Wireless Infrastructure Deployment Act by the Florida Legislature, but will be referred to as the Act in this memorandum. The Act substantially amends Sections 337-401 Florida statutes relating to the use of public, municipal, or county right-of-way and structures located within the right-of-way for broadband or wireless facility infrastructure. With various limited exceptions, the Act provides for the installation of small wireless facilities on government-owned poles and other poles and structures located in the right-of-way, installation of ground-mounted equipment in the right-of-way, installation of new poles in the right-of-way, and installation of micro-wireless facilities. The Act provides a specified process a government must follow to accept applications for permits and to process and issue permits. Generally, a government must either approve or deny a completed application within 60 days after receipt of the application. The Act sets forth various standards by which an application may be denied. Installation is subject to applicable codes, which includes local codes or ordinances adopted to implement the Act and objective design standards adopted by ordinance to meet reasonable locational context, color, stealth, and concealment requirements. The Act restricts the amount that may be charged for permit fees and also restricts the rate to install a small wireless facility on a government utility pole to not exceed $150 per pole annually. The proposed temporary moratorium would temporarily suspend all permitting activities relating to the installation of wireless devices and infrastructure on utility public poles. The moratorium will provide adequate time for city staff to analyze and propose the required design standards to meet reasonable location, context, color, stealth, and concealment requirements. It will also allow the city staff the opportunity to propose the approval process and procedures as may be necessary and appropriate to amend the city's Code of Ordinances or the city's Land Development Code. The temporary moratorium established by Ordinance 1654 shall take effect immediately upon the date of City Council adoption and shall terminate on September 30th, 2017. No applications for approval subject to the moratorium will be accepted by the city until the moratorium has expired. The temporary moratorium set forth in this ordinance shall expire prior to the termination date set forth herein if the City Council enacts an ordinance addressing the matters regulated by the provisions of the Act. The zoning progress doctrine has taken effect upon the first reading of Ordinance number 1654 during the City Council meeting on June 19, 2017. Thus, the effect of the moratorium are now in place. The City Attorney has assisted in the preparation of this matter and drafted the proposed ordinance. City staff recommends adoption of Ordinance number 1654, and we would like to propose a change in the ordinance to correct the fifth whereas on page 1, and it says, whereas on June 23, 2017, Governor Rick Scott approved House Bill 687 over the objection expressed and will strike through not only by the City Commission, and we'll just say objections expressed by numerous local governments and advocacy groups. The City Council conducted the first reading of Ordinance number 1654 on June 19, 2017, and conducted the second hearing and the public hearing on July 17th. The third reading and the adoption public hearing will be occurring on August 7th, 2017. The City has complied with all requirements and procedures of Florida law in processing and advertising this ordinance, and it's recommended that the LPA recommend approval of ordinance number 1654. This concludes my presentation. I have just distributed to you all a map that shows all the poles in the city and who owns the poles. The city does not have many electrical poles in the city, but we would like to have the time for the moratorium to be able to regulate, because the new bill will allow companies to install new poles. So because of that, we would like to have time to develop our standards, and our development review manager is already working on the ordinance draft that we'll bring to the boards for consideration. If you have any questions, I'm available.
Thank you. Are there any questions of staff?
Why don't you go ahead?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Young?
I just want to clarify for everyone's benefit that the map depicts primarily Oviedo on the Park for the city maintain and own poles, utility poles, that there really aren't any other clusters elsewhere in the city?
Not at this point. So all the poles that we own are the ones in the, around Oviedo on the Park. The new streets that will be are being built are also going to be city poles.
Within the park?
Within the park.
Correct.
Well, within Oviedo on the Park, yes.
Okay.
And although they are not many, they are crucial, right? Because they are decorative poles, so we want also to be able to regulate how, any device will affect the look of the poles.
Sure.
Mr. Lopez?
So I just want to clarify, Teresa, this is so that it gives the city time to come up with guidelines for the polls?
Yes.
And that's the only intention?
Yes, I think we are okay with the idea of having, the,
What if the city wants to do their own in Oviedo on the Park? Because that'll be a conflict against this with other providers. Because the city could become their own provider. Has that been addressed?
Then they would be exempt if they become a municipal, is that what you mean? If they become a utility?
well, if we have a utility company, then everything would be subject to our design guidelines. Is that what you mean?
No, I don't
If-
think that. I know you were mumbling something to her.
Well,
Yeah.
are you meaning if they,
Well, like a lot of municipalities around the state, let's take, for example, Leesburg.
Have
They ran their own fiber throughout their geographical area.
right,
Are we going to write something in the plan, for instance, that the city can do its own Wi-Fi within certain geographical areas within the city? That's
Well,
the question. And if you're going to write the ordinance that way.
If it's our
be
own
bound by it?
infrastructure in our own right-of-way, we don't need any restrictions, right? These are restrictions to private companies to install poles and devices in the right-of-way in our poles.
I understand that. But what I'm saying is, unfortunately, I do have to know a little bit about the Wi-Fi industry.
Okay.
So they're not small boxes. They're going to be pretty large on the bottom. There's going to be antennas on the top that do 360-degree angles. But what I'm saying is, will this the state legislature, will it prevent the cities from providing their own network? That's my question. Do we know that?
I don't think so, but we can research that. And Dave, do you have any information on that?
Can you come up to the
Because
microphone,
if the city
please?
decides to decide to do it, they need to write it in the new guidelines.
And this is why we need the time to research what is at stake, right, for the cities.
These are just design standards for private providers on our poles or placement of poles within our municipal right-of-way. Now, as far as banning cities being banned from doing their own telecommunications, that is not addressed in this bill. If it were allowed or banned, that would be something that would be currently within law or a future proposal of the legislature.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Does that answer your question? Okay. Are there any other questions of staff?
I just have a quick question regarding the application. So I see these are all light poles. Does the statute apply to all utility poles, including power poles, or just,
All utility poles.
Okay.
Unless you're a municipal electric utility, then they're exempt.
Public, yeah.
say that again, I'm sorry?
The municipal electric utilities are exempted. Those are the only ones.
Okay,
like
so-
a park that generates their own power.
Correct.
So if you have, like we have in parts of the older parts of Oviedo, where we have poles, interspersed throughout the neighborhoods, and are those also subject to that statute where basically a telecommunications company can come and in somebody's yard essentially put one of these stations or essentially add another pole? Is that what this is suggesting?
Well, this is just regulating the right-of-way, in public right-of-way.
Right. And so I guess,
If there are
Potentially,
easements,
which
yeah.
is why we want to do the moratorium, so that we can make sure that we do what we can to protect whatever we can protect.
no, absolutely. And I guess the reason why I was requesting for clarification is, street lights are one thing. There's a lot more power poles than there are street lights. And I guess what I want to make sure of is that the city looks into how the power poles could be affected. We want to. I personally, where I live, I have power poles in my backyard. I wouldn't want them adding a third power pole or a wireless pole in the middle of my private property, because it's technically between two spans. Because I have a span that runs over my yard. And there's a lot of people that have that, not just me. So what I wouldn't want to see is a telecommunications company coming into my neighborhood and saying, we're going to put a cell pole in the middle of your yard because we're allowed to do it. I want to make sure there's protections for private residents if the right-of-way goes through, parts of property that's actually being utilized. Does that make sense?
Dave, do you?
The future proposed changes are going to be right now to the Code of Ordinances, Section 42, that regulates the right-of-ways as far as telecommunications in the right-of-ways. We have LDC codes that talk about telecommunications on private property, so that would more than likely be covered under that. So somebody just couldn't come out and just, boom, stick a pole in the middle of your yard unless there's some sort of utility easement or something across that would let them do that. So unless it's in an easement, you have to give permission for somebody to do something like that, or unless it's in a right-of-way, then they can do those sort of things as long as they have an agreement with the city to do those sort of things.
Right, and in those instances where there is a right-of-way, the agreement part where they have to have an agreement with the city, I guess I would just, for people's benefit who live in the city, to see that the city protects those people, even if there is a right-of-way, and even though the city does have a right to allow the telecommunications company to erect a pole in the middle of their property, I'd like to see protections for people's private property.
And that is, I think, what we need to understand.
I'm sure that's what our goal will be.
Yes.
To the extent allowed by the legislature. It is anticipated that this legislation will be challenged legally in the courts.
The purpose of the moratorium, as was stated by everybody here, is to give us time to draft that ordinance to make those protections, because we don't want to be broadsided by something. All of a sudden it becomes an issue within our city, either from a static standpoint or a location standpoint. We need that moratorium in place to give us time to do this. And other cities are trying to come forward with similar legislation. They're in the same boat we are. So it's coordinating with everybody to try to get the perfect ordinance to address the situations. So that's the purpose of the moratorium, so we get time to do that. But your comments are duly noted.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Young?
Just to reiterate again, Teresa, the purpose of this moratorium as it relates to what we're talking about here tonight is to discuss these infrastructure improvements on city-owned utility poles.
And in the right-of-way, if they bring something new in our right-of-way.
Sure. So does that allow us or deny us the control rights over Duke utility poles? We don't have any control over Duke utility poles. So if Bright House, or Spectrum comes in and says, hey, we want to wire broadband all the way down Mitchell Hammock or in someone's backyard where we have an easement to provide that utility right now, there's nothing that we're voting on tonight that's going to restrict them from doing so, because they already have the easement rights. They control that utility through that area, correct?
Well, right now, we are just asking for a moratorium, right, to study. But my understanding is that, no, we cannot.
Sure. Yeah, and I was just trying to clarify for the board that we're discussing city-owned utility poles.
And infrastructure in the right-of-way. So if they come with new poles or new boxes in our right-of-way, we have an opportunity to regulate the design.
But in easements or elsewhere where Duke has private utility easements, that's off the books.
Yes, that's my understanding.
I mean, there's already, to me, it's not completely surprising due to the fact that even in the land platting process, there's a required section on, land plats regarding that easements shall also be for I can't recite the language, but it's in there that basically you can't discriminate against, what did it say, telecommunication providers? I can't recite it off the top of my head. You might be able to.
I've read it enough. You think I would?
Yeah,
but it's basically on lines. You cannot you cannot be discriminatory, and you have to be openly selective with telecommunications providers. Something along those lines.
Yeah. So this isn't entirely new.
Sure.
Mr. Lopez?
You were here when Clearwire petitioned the city, remember?
When? Sorry, when?
A couple years back, you remember Clearwire came in and we gave them the rights to put equipment on certain poles around the city. Remember that?
I don't think I was in the city.
That's basically the same thing that's going on now. So they abandoned some of their equipment, so you might want to find out if you want to research to give you an idea what you're looking at.
Okay.
Are there any other questions of staff?
I have a question.
Mr. Madden?
So I'm just trying, I understand that the point is just to give us time, so I'm trying to understand in the top of page 2 in that first paragraph, the way I'm reading this, the act already actually gives the city 3 months to come up with this from the time of the first application or January 1st, whichever comes first. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
I'm sorry.
Are you talking
where
about the
It's
staff
on the first
memo?
paragraph.
On the
It's not
staff
page
memo,
two.
yeah.
Oh,
sorry.
staff
Page
memo.
2 on the staff
Page
memo,
two.
the first paragraph.
Of what?
Of
Which
the-
document?
Of ours.
Yes,
Of the staff
ours.
report?
The staff,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. Okay.
Right, that's from the statute, I believe.
These are for the rates, right?
What was the
annual
question?
rates.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, it says rates, fees, and other terms. I mean, I would imply other terms means whatever other code conditions you want to put in place.
Correct.
My understanding of reading this is you already have a 3-month buffer based on whenever the first application comes in. So the moratorium is technically just adding 3 more months to that. Would that be fair to say? That, I mean, basically by enacting the moratorium now to September 30th, and then that's the first application that can be accepted, pushes you 3 months beyond that to January 1st. I mean, that's the way I'm reading these two things
I think
together.
the
that-
moratorium is in place to be, for the time period before then, because it's saying we have to do it within 3 months of receiving a request or by January 1st, 2018. Am I reading that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that if we got in any applications now, that 3 months would start kicking, but if we put the moratorium in place, it would not.
Right,
Correct?
that's what I'm saying. That so the more, by putting the moratorium in place, it pushes that application back to October 1st, and you still have 3 months after that, till January 1st, to actually come up with anything. By the way, these two things would work together. I mean, that's the way I'm understanding it, is really, we're not asking for 3 months. We're really pushing it back 6 months. By doing so.
Mr. Lopez?
My understanding is that you have either or.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
My understanding is you have either or. If someone were to approve, come in and apply today, we would have 3 months to come up with a,
But if the moratorium's in place, then technically, doesn't that push that application
It'll
back
terminate
to
on September 30th.
September 30th, as technically the date that application is accepted?
So no application would be accepted until after the until after September 30th.
But it also says that after receiving an application, the government has 60 days to completely deny or approve it. So,
But you have 3 months from the first one to establish the rules to accept or deny. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that since if there's already a 3-month buffer in there, why does the city need another 3 months on top of that? I mean, because right now, if you got an application today, by the way I'm reading this, you have 3 months to come up with that code and rules and whatever else you're going to put in place before you have to then accept that first one. And then it's 60 days after for everyone after that.
I think it's because of the broad, I can't speak for all of staff, but I think it's because of the possible broad applications and the potential.
I'm sorry, can you speak up a little?
I believe it, you couldn't hear me? I believe it's because of the broad implications that they need to consider. It may take a little longer than that. We know it needs to go to multiple readings through City Commission, and it'll have to be drafted. They'll probably want to review other ordinances from other cities that are enacted, see how things go. That's my understanding.
this legislation actually was an initiative from the city attorney. When he heard about the bill, he brought to council, actually, he read by the title of the ordinance on June 19th to start the zoning progress because he was afraid, and other cities were afraid, that they would have an application on July 1st. Right? They would have, and some cities have been receiving a lot of applications already. I mean, we haven't. So the attorney was proactive to say, let's request a moratorium so that we can be, proactive to say that we will study the subject and we'll bring an ordinance to City Council, to LPA and City Council before September 30th. So this was the request. I think it's being proactive and trying to and understand before having an application, because we don't even have a procedure for an application. So we want to establish the process, everything before having an application.
So would the staff be expecting to then, before that September, if the moratorium were in place before September 30th when it expires, to have it completely drafted and approved by the council before that
Yes,
date.
that's why we're
Everything we would
rushing.
need,
Yes.
everything would be.
Yes.
I mean, the expectation is that the staff would have that, would be able to complete that in time.
That is the plan. Yes, to bring. We're already studying and
I mean, the League of Cities is playing a large part in this, and some of their concerns include what she's saying, reviewing current ordinances, how they'll apply, registration processes, notice requirements. I mean, there's just a variety, timelines on applications, permit fees. There's a whole big range of things that staff needs to figure out on this. It's a pretty broad thing.
And even the application itself, who reviews that, how much will be who, because we route the application for several different departments, right? So we'll have to establish that process for this application. So we wanted to be proactive and do that before facing a bunch of applications.
City of Tampa is also doing a moratorium for 180 days. There are many cities that are doing the moratorium. We aren't the only one.
Okay, thank you.
If you have any more questions about it, the statute's attached in our packet at the end. There's some very strict time periods provided for in the statute that staff needs to be able to have a process in place to comply with those timelines. Otherwise, the folks get their permit whether the city likes it or not, if we don't comply. Is there any other questions? Question for staff? Okay, we'll open it up for public hearing. Is there anyone wishing to speak to the board on this item? Seeing none, we'll close public hearing. What's the board's pleasure?
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion to recommend approval of ordinance number 1654 as presented.
As amended.
Is that with
As
the staff's
amended?
corrections?
Yes, corrected, as amended.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Second.
Mr. Lopez, is there any discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. This item will be considered by the City Council August 7th at 6:30 in these chambers. Next item on the agenda are discussion items. We don't have anything listed. Does anyone have anything for the board? Okay. Next item are future meeting dates, August 8th and August 22nd. Does anyone know now they won't?
I may not be here on the 8th. I don't know.
On the 8th? Okay. Be sure and let Dahlia know as soon as you...
Do we have any
Yeah.
meetings? Do we have a meeting? Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Is there anything on the agenda for that?
Yes, we have an item, another ordinance.
If there's nothing else, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Sheridan. Mr. Minton? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We stand adjourned.